Okay, everyone, we're about to start the final session. We have two panelists and then two commentaries. I'll introduce the first panelist right now is Dr. M. Michael Jahi Chappell. Michael is Jahi is what is it that you do? Oh, he's conducted really path-breaking research on body wash.
You're not wrong.
Jahi actually is the Director of Agroecology and Agricultural Policy at the Institute for Agricultural and Trade Policy in Minneapolis. And then I wrote here, but now I let the cat out of the bag, perhaps best known from his days as a chemical engineer when he conducted path-breaking research on body wash formulated for Procter & Gamble in his beloved Cincinnati, Ohio. It's an in-joke, okay? Subsequently, his work on the food security program in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, was path-breaking in its interdisciplinary focus on biodiversity conservation, agroecology, and urban institution building. His blog, which is still called, I think, his blog, my blog, or what's it? Oh no, what is his name?
Agro-Eco People?
Oh, Agro-Eco People. His blog is really great, and it gets a lot of hits. A lot of people read his blog. Nobody reads my blog. And anyway, here's Jahi.
I'm glad you're still having fun, John. So John told me and Peter, well, you guys are towards the end, so I want it to really be, really great. Don't screw it up. And so then I was listening to all the different talks to try and bring things together, and they said, "What? Why are you still writing it? It's almost time." So tried to do both of those, and so the title of my talk has changed slightly, but the idea is pretty similar, but this is Food Sovereignty and Democracy is Showing Up. So I want to use the time to build on the excellent comments and presentations we've heard the past 3 days. I think it started with a really great event in Detroit on Wednesday night. I think that was really important that we actually had an event as part of this, and I thank the organizers both here and in Detroit for pulling that off. So I want to highlight after this past couple of days, maybe three elements of food sovereignty. One, food sovereignty as sovereignty, or taking sovereignty seriously. Food sovereignty as an imaginary, building on Annette's comments yesterday about the importance and the right to imagine. And then food sovereignty as strategy and tactics, and especially what it might mean for scholars, but also for activists, and from what we've already seen on the ground in terms of many movements and groups and coalitions, via Capitalism and Detroit Black Food Security Network, not least among them, what we can learn and see and grow from there. So in terms of food sovereignty as sovereignty, we've heard several references yesterday to agrarian citizenship, a term Dr. Whitman has used in her scholarship, and which she credits the Brazilian Rural Workers Movement, the MST, with developing. In our recent report at ITP that I co-wrote with an intern, Jill Carlson, actually also a U of M grad, we also highlighted the terms food sovereignty and food democracy alongside agrarian citizenship. And these are all very exciting terms, exciting ideas, and it's important, I think really important, that so much of the energy and elaboration for these have come from social movements themselves. And so I kind of wonder if maybe a funny thing happened on the way to the academic forum. We have these terms, we have agrarian citizenship, food sovereignty, food justice, food democracy. So they all share two things. They share first a focus on the agri-food system, agrarian or food or agriculture, on farmers and citizens and eaters and consumers. That's one part. But food is only food sovereignty's first name. Its last name, so to speak, is sovereignty. And so we've heard other terms trickling up like water sovereignty, cognitive sovereignty, seed sovereignty. And so I think we should maybe take this last name thing seriously. We should think about the family of sovereignty. We should think about not just the food sovereignty and its siblings, so to speak, but also the really roots, the political sovereignty, economic sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, or community sovereignty. And so although food sovereignty itself does have, I think, a really strong focus and aspirational root in the community, and the focus of the movements have often been very tactically and strategically aligned with other groups and other people's struggles, like the World March for Women has been longtime partner of Via Campesina, among other important groups that have other issues as their key issue. I think this sort of strategic alliance building on the ground is maybe not sufficiently reflected in the scholarship and the allyship of those who are a little bit farther from the front lines. I think this is partly because, as was mentioned yesterday, the scholarship has sort of been a little bit late to the game, somewhat in terms of food sovereignty. It's been around for quite some time as a topic and is sort of heating up now. There is, of course, a lot of excellent work being done, much of it by the speakers and other attendees here, our comrade scholars and activists around the world, and more people are putting the questions of gender and of oppression, of indigenous rights, water, seed rights, really center stage. But I think compared to the focus and intensity of food sovereignty with this intersection with other movements from the beginning, I think we've got a little bit farther to go. So it's interesting to note, for example, the 2009 Declaration of the Rights of Peasants, Women, and Men, after its preamble, this document from Via Campesina says women peasants and men peasants have equal rights. And so the document ends with women and men, so the gender thing there is pretty obvious. It gives gender equality a really prominent place. Actually, if you look at the document, that statement is second only to the statement of peasant identity as the beginning of it. So if we linger on this point for a moment and think about gender dynamics and equity and how they've been a key point of Via Campesina's evolution, as either Annette or Peter said yesterday, that Via Campesina may be the only movement that changed its structure in order to really address gender, only transnational movement to do so. And when I've talked to members of Via, in my experience at least, they've pretty much universally said, well, I'm glad that you think that we're doing great stuff on gender, but we see how far we have to go, so we're not that impressed, which I think is the right attitude. I think in contrast, I think we've had an excellent session here, and we've done very well in a lot of ways, but at this conference and many others, I think we have a long way to go to catch up. I would say gender has come up here strongly, but has not been, I would say, almost co-equal to everything else. It hasn't been the second most talked about thing, I would say, in the past couple of days. So we've name-checked it. Some of us have even gone into it a little bit, but I would say it doesn't have that primacy of place that it's taken in the discussions within the movements. And so just doing also a very scientifically shoddy study, sorry, Jen and exact scientists, but so there's 301,000 hits on Google Scholar for food sovereignty. I'm sure that's probably an overcount, but that goes to 80,000 when you add gender to it. So I think our scholarship does have ways to catch up before, it's maybe half of the scholarship at least includes that, in a Google search. That's just anywhere in the paper. So again, I think when we think of this family of ideas and ideals of agrarian citizenship, food justice, food sovereignty, food democracy, we should ask ourselves, I think, if we're really adequately addressing in what we do as well as what we study, the justice, citizenship, sovereignty part as much as the food, agriculture, agroecology part. So when I say we should take sovereignty seriously, I think we need to extend our work way beyond just thinking about what food sovereignty looks like, what it means, how it might be realized, but to also ask sovereignty, what sovereignty looks like, and agency, as Professor Jones mentioned earlier, and how those are realized. So I came across a piece yesterday by geographer Jesse Ribaud, and he quotes Francis Moore Lepay saying that hunger is caused not by a scarcity of food, but a scarcity of democracy. He goes on to quote Michael Watts, who's a very established political ecologist, who says that democratization must remove the straitjacket which stifles the peasantry, because any popular movement to transform political life must sever the hold that ruling classes exercise over rural producers. I think we need to take this seriously and to think, of course, not just of the peasantry, but also think of the same straitjacket and the same ruling and privileged classes that impose on urban residents, particularly residents of color, women, and particularly women of color, poor residents, laborers, the unemployed, the huge number of incarcerated people we have in the United States, and the former incarcerated who we also make more vulnerable. And so when we look at this larger straitjacket of, I'd say, really related struggles around sovereignty, and we go back to a bit of a paraphrase of Professor Ribaud, he says that vulnerability is a state that weakens bargaining position, enabling, for example, labor exploitation. That bargaining position is a key material basis of citizenship and representation. Emancipation requires sufficient wealth beyond mere subsistence to enable the individual, household, group, or community to walk away from daily labor long enough to engage in shaping the political economy that shapes their rights and representation. Real citizenship is that ability, the ability to influence those who govern. Real democracy is when that influence results in a response. And I would go a bit farther and say, real sovereignty is when that response is shaped by and with and from the community and responds directly to the needs identified and coming from the community. So, in his earlier talk, Brother Malik talked about the problems and oppression of capitalism, and we have a pretty obvious problem, or many obvious problems around this. We have, of course, a huge amount of corporate concentration, especially but far from exclusively in the food system. Malik mentioned the auto companies, and I'd say their relationship with Detroit is emblematic of any number of communities around the world that have come to be under the domination, even oppression of large corporate interests, who starve communities of investment, except when it serves, of course, their own interests. And of course, they pull out these investments, these jobs and tax revenue, if they're even paying tax revenue, when it pleases them, and to punish those who might demand more. And we even have incredibly direct examples of colonization of our rights by these large players, like our trade deals, the fast track bill going before the House probably next week, which would give President Obama the ability to probably pass this really big Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been negotiated behind closed doors. It's had, the exception to that is dozens of observers who came from private concerns, none from civil society organizations. Congress wouldn't get to read it before, of course, basically sort of coming to an up and down vote when the actual trade deal came down. And it would likely, we don't know for sure since we won't have the final text, would likely include investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which is basically corporate kangaroo courts where corporations can sue countries, sovereign, supposedly, countries, if the regulations in those countries may hurt their expected profits. So think about that for a second. The special right that companies have, citizens don't, to challenge a democratically passed law because you didn't make as much money as you thought you were going to make. So fast track is going before the House probably next week. Definitely talk to your Congress member about it. If you have not, give a call. The Citizens Trade Campaign has got really great information, and you can also go to iatp.org/trade secrets. But this is just one example of how our system puts capital in a position above citizens. So I'd say this is one of the reasons why Via Campesina, in that Declaration of the Rights of Peasants, Women, and Men, has in its preamble the statement that the policies of neoliberalism worsen the violations of peasants' rights, and they celebrate and call for the struggle of peasants to uphold and protect their rights. And we see, of course, that this struggle and this counter-narrative is necessary because Margaret Thatcher famously, among others, have been infamous for saying about capitalism that there is no alternative. So Tina. So I didn't come up with a clever new acronym, but for a while I've been thinking to myself that it seems like it should be maybe Tina TFS, that there is no alternative to food sovereignty. If we're going to think about what could possibly bring the things we're talking about, I don't know if there's another way to do it. If we think about our long-term goals, we think about universal access to sufficient healthy food produced, processed, the food process chain, as Andy pointed out yesterday, prepared, all in a manner that gives dignity and due to farmers, to laborers, to caretakers, working parents, communities, and of course, again, women in particular, gives them their equal pride of place. This is something capitalism was not designed to do, and in fact, as Erico Jimenez has observed, the capitalist system is working exactly as it was meant to. So, thinking about it for a second, I think Andy warned us about dichotomous thinking, which is, I think, always a good thing to keep in mind, but I think there's really good scientific reasons to doubt that capitalism can do otherwise. It's claimed often that capitalism is about the management of scarcity, but if we use sort of common sense, it's self-apparent that it's more about the accumulation and management of surplus. If you think about it, capital, that's right in the name. That's part of it, it's its first name. So, you might say surplus, actually, with air quotes, because, of course, the profits or land you're speculating on or the investments you're making using intentionally mysterious financial instruments, this supposed surplus exists alongside, of course, hunger, poverty, overexploitation, and degradation of both people and the environment. So somehow it's still surplus. This, of course, you could, if you want to tie this to Marx's labor theory of value or to the idea of the metabolic rift. But as I say, I don't know if we have to go much farther than just common sense. The creation and management of surplus from exchange, the way it works and the way it's always worked, is defining surpluses happening even if this surplus happens to destroy people and resources or exists alongside forced or coerced austerity. So as important as skepticism, nuance, and careful science are, I think we really need to grapple with the possibility, not just that we need to interrogate food sovereignty, but also TINA, TFS, that there might not be an alternative to food sovereignty. Which is not to say that it's one concrete thing or we know exactly how to do it, but going back to Professor Jones's point about the farmers he works with, and we have to consider them. We can't only think of the long-term future. But there's no necessarily reason to think that even if whatever we you're talking about, successfully helps them increase production or they migrate to the city, that the cities can indefinitely absorb all of the migrants that might come from the countryside, or that producing more is going to help all of them, because really if there's hundreds of millions of poor farmers and they all start producing more, we're going to have that whole price supply drop thing again, and so we might end up really back where we started again. So there's really, there's certainly no evidence or guarantee that cities or capitalism is going to lift every single person up. If we look at history, that's neither what it was designed to do, nor what we have evidence for it doing. And so, again, that might not be a valid alternative to try and reform the current system. And so, as much as we want to respect, I think, and work directly with people on the ground and respect their needs and desires, if we're thinking scientifically, we might also have to think that it's not possible to do that through the means that the traditional means. And there's, I think, a really amazing direct example of this. One of those things where someone quotes something, says something, and you imagine them curling their mustache, or you think it must be like a Colbert impersonation of them. But the American Soybean Association and USAID had this guy, this visionary, Stephen Kwan, who said, thought that if we can get Afghans to eat soybeans, to grow and eat soybeans, that'll really help them out with protein in their diet, and I can just see it, and it's gonna be great. And Afghans didn't really have a history of soybeans or necessarily want them, but he thought this could really work. So USAID and the American Soybean Association, always trustworthy, good partners, joined up with him, and this guy, Stephen Kwan, seemed to be a true believer, and he was taken aback that the Soybean Association demanded that the farmers sell the soybeans to the processing factory instead of using them to cook at home. The association said, Kwan's group's insistence on teaching the farmers how to cook soybeans for home use was a deal breaker. And this is exact quote: "That wasn't the philosophy of this development project. The farmer is just the first step in the value chain. If the farmer is consuming the soybeans, that runs counter to the project." So, as important it is to remember that I think most people are not living the dichotomy, that there are lots of people living in the middle, as Professor Jones pointed out, that doesn't mean that there is not an actual dichotomy there in terms of the vision and the direction that things are trying to be taken in. So the paradigm of development that depends on value chains, on cheap food, on cheap inputs, on migration to cities, on technology defined by using less labor and creating more profit, that system sort of says, well, healthy food access, human well-being, sovereignty, that's a good byproduct. If that happens, that's fine. But when the choice comes down to profits or to human well-being, right now, I think we know what often is chosen. And I have 5 minutes left. So second point of 3. So food sovereignty as an imaginary. So I would say that we also need food sovereignty as imaginary, as this other pole of a system that does prioritize these human rights we're talking about over profit, because that's not what the current system was even designed to do. And so we need to embrace the right to dream. I'd say we have an obligation, indeed, to dream. So let's see, what can I skip? So in those terms, it doesn't necessarily make sense to ask in the abstract, does localization as an independent factor increase nutrition and health? Because food sovereignty's narrative is not defined in the abstract as just local is what we want because we want local. It's also defined very specifically in response to this TINA, the market is the only way, the control should be in these oligarchical companies, international companies, and not communities, and not just an argument for localization just for localization. Now, there's places and people that boil the narrative down to that, that's true, but that's not the same as where it comes from. But I think that's another really important element. We need to keep in mind that imagination, in a way, about the future is the most scientific thing we could do. If we look at history, we can say with pretty good confidence that this is not the last economic system we're going to have. The mercantilists, the pharaohs, everyone thought like this is, we've reached it, we've got it. So there's no reason to think that what we have now is the one. So thinking about what the next system will be and how to get there to a better one, I think is it's not just an alternative or an option, but there will be an alternative. We know that, so we should really try and shape that very consciously. But besides that, as John mentioned, the tools of Western science are really powerful, and so we can and must put them at the disposal of those who aren't sharing in the supposed surplus. But we also need to, beyond that, think about the tools and the resources and our privilege and power so that we can create a space not just where science is serving these communities, but that they are part of this imagination. It's not just us, it's not just the leaders coming and imagining things, that it's with the communities themselves. And they may disagree, they may agree, but I think when you enter into a real dialogue as citizens, that's what the work is to be done. And I think also to radically shorten this, from the scholarly point of view, there's the really interesting and Nobel Prize winning work of Eleanor Ostrom on local institutions, which people point out often correctly. You know, she didn't prove everything is always better when it's local. Leaving aside other nuances, I would say, however, that her and her colleagues' work is the best empirical and theoretically validated form of governance, that we don't have anything like that kind of evidence for centralized or large-scale governance of combining theory with field studies. So it's true it's not the end-all be-all, but I would say actually has a better evidence base than anything else that we're doing or might want to do. So there's a good theoretical reason for community power in that local tip. So another obvious insight from Ostrom, thinking now finally, third point, I've got like probably 30 seconds or so. Food sovereignty as strategy and tactics. Another insight from the work of Ostrom and others that is one of those brilliant but obvious ones is that social trust builds unity and power and makes success in your struggle more likely. But showing up, showing unity, working together, and using our power in service to others, of course, in turn, builds trust. So you're going to have that virtuous cycle, but you have to enter that at some point. So what I mean by this tactically is those of us who want food sovereignty, who believe that's a really good framework and idea, we also need to show up, whether we're academics or activists, for other fights. Because these other fights in sovereignty and democracy, they share the last name. It's part of the same family. And also, if you look at the evidence, we can't just do it only doing our own little bit. There's also the interesting thing that, the fights that are going to be fought and the movement actions, they may not fit into our scholarly frameworks no matter how careful we are, because as Hart and Negri pointed out, scholars are always going to be behind movements. Movements are the ones who are creating the reality that we're studying. We wouldn't have said it's possible to do a variety of things before it actually happens. And so we can't just depend on that, but also I think depend on showing up and being with these groups. So can we have any doubt scientifically that the movements and the communities that have made these changes have crucially mattered in changing access to food, to healthcare, to education, to the increases in well-being that we often attribute to science and technology, when of course all these improvements were happening at the same time? We can't just pull out the technology part. I sympathize with Jen's discomfort when people say quote unquote science, but the quote unquote science is focused so much on just the tech and not on studying what is showing up, what does being citizens together really mean. So to wrap up, I think that there's, because I just got a sign that says please wrap up. I think there are three questions in terms of those of us who are on the scholarly side or research side can ask ourselves specifically in terms of evidence, not just what's the evidence for our hypothesis, but what's the evidence that our work is something communities who are struggling have asked for? What's the evidence that what we're doing will contribute to strengthening their livelihoods or their struggle? And what's the evidence that what we're doing is something that moves us in a direction leading away from a researcher community activist dichotomy and towards a real partnership where it's just two equally sovereign communities working together? Thank you.
Any questions that you might have? Peter.
Well, I want to thank you, Jahi, for saying that scholars are up and behind movements. So I think, as you're talking about first names and last names, they're called movements because they're moving out in front. But on a more serious vein, I seriously believe that the center of production of new knowledge and new theory about many really important things is now coming from, and maybe always has been coming from, social movements. Food sovereignty, how to grow crops more ecologically, how to govern ourselves in a rotating and collective manner, critical pedagogy, all kinds of different areas of theory and practice it's social movements that are leading the way, and it's scholars who are scrambling to not fall too far behind and to come up with explanations for it. So I just want to say thank you for saying that.
Look, I don't see any hands right now, so.
Sorry, this is more of a comment than a question. Thank you for the presentation. I think it's a really important point. I think if I tied what you should place an update on what Dr. Chappell was doing. Part of the challenge of creating those true partnerships is that neoliberalism is reshaping universities.
Would you speak louder?
I'm sorry. The universities, or the neoliberal model is changing universities such that we're not able to create those true partnerships because of the amount of production, scholarly production we have to engage in, and the use of contingent labor in academic research and teaching. So I don't know if you or anyone else wants to comment on how we actually do create those real partnerships where we're actually partnering for kind of participatory action research, at the same time meet the demands of this industrial research complex that we all have to find ourselves.
Yeah, I think that, so this was a little bit in the part of the presentation that I overwrote. But I think that that's one of the things we can also ask from a scholarly perspective in terms of, well, what are the things that we can do, not just what can we do in terms of participatory action research, but to change the material basis of how we're judged. And I'd say, just as one possible challenge, I think we can use our creativity and imagination to think of lots of ways to do that. But one possible challenge, especially for tenured faculty, is to, you could say, a form of civil disobedience, of insisting on being pro-tenure for people who did not necessarily produce as many papers, but if there's a real impact to the community, say, they have community impact, that's part of our mission, and to me, that counts. And it's not going to change overnight, but we have some amazing people, I think, in this room who do stand up for some of that work, but we can shift the balance even more and just refuse, that's not going to end it by itself, but just take some steps to refuse to actually fit into that model, given that we have a pretty amazing amount of freedom.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Could I just comment on that? So I think the academic establishment, to a certain degree, and the way that research is funded is changed. Sorry. I think that the research environment and the way that research is funded is changing to a certain degree. I mean, I did my studies and some of my academic work based in the UK, and the way that the UK funding system is working in terms of research is that research proposals more and more have to include a large part about research impact. And it's not just a kind of tick box that you have to do. These impact statements or impact case studies actually dictate how much public funding goes into universities. So the more you can show that the research is having an impact, the more funding is actually coming into the university. Now the NSF has a similar kind of statement that you have to put in, but I don't think that it's to the same degree that it is in the UK and also in other European countries. I'm thinking about European Union funding. So I think it is moving in the right direction, but I think that there's still a way to go in terms of actually having that as a kind of counterpoint. That if you can't show that your research is actually having any impact, you shouldn't be able to get a money.
If I could add really quickly to that, I think this is it's a long-term potential, which we all have trouble dealing with, but I think it's another reason to think about real community collaboration, especially for public institutions and those that are maybe more place-based, residential-based, like Washington State, Vancouver, that I used to work at. We've seen, of course, a huge problem with funding for universities. It seems to me that if we really are working closely with communities, there's going to be a different kind and a new kind of support for universities. There's this huge town-down separation in so many places that I've been, and it's quite a different thing, I think, if you think the university is actually on your side to actually push your congressperson or your representatives to say, well, we can't cut funding there. It's not, again, not an easy thing, but I think that that's a potential that's really underexplored in a long game kind of way.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think, this whole idea of really being very attentive to and to collaborate with social movements in a way that is very respectful of the direct theory that they create. And I can't remember the name of the scholar who came up with that. She's a feminist scholar, an American, I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, somebody can Google it, direct theory. So I think that that's so important. But it also has all kinds of implications for how we do work with social movements. And this whole struggle, the university, academia, the academy, we're the last ones to actually neo-liberalize in many ways. I mean, all other sectors went through it years ago. So what we need to do is, again, push back and, what about a community impact factor? Why is it that we're letting the academy say, well, the only thing we're going to measure is the impact factor, as if there's only one, We're actually really starting to work on that in some universities in Canada to insist that, no, what you guys have to measure is the impact, the community impact. Which is a very interesting, in order to do that, you need to be able to be working very carefully within community so that they can help you develop those criteria. But I guess I was just going to ask you, sorry, I was just going to ask you, can you maybe give some examples of how, some successful examples of how academics can work collaboratively with social movements? Because there is a lot of tension, and maybe talk a little bit about how useful protocols are, if they are, or is the idea of a protocol even too much of a problem?
Well, I'm going to have to completely defer, Annette, to you or Peter perhaps, for his presentation is next, because I think that you guys have been pioneers in that. My research was on for my PhD was a city program, and so as much as I would like to work with movements and do work with movements at the NGO at ITP, I wouldn't say I've got a good gauge on the scholarly intersection, except for my own experiences with Via Campesina. I think the humility that Naeem mentioned earlier is immensely important. That was sort of the point of all of my classes when I was teaching, was sort of radical humility. And I think the goal is a very difficult one, a high bar to get to, that I think to you and Peter have, to agree, at least from the outside, to and actually I'd say Eric, though he's not, strictly speaking, an academic.
Recovery.
Yeah, you're much better now. Have gotten to is when you have, I think, a real relationship, then you actually can debate in a way. So you could, as Andy was talking about the farmers there, if you have a real relationship, you can at least exchange real ideas and say, well, I still think it should be this way. And that balance between debating and still using your privilege and power in service of them is, I think, really difficult. But the closer you can get to what I always said is, just treating each other like you're both adults. You're both even adults. Then you don't have to agree with everything a movement or a citizen says, but really listening is a very different thing than, as I think Naeem said before, coming in saying, well, this is the way I think it should be. Or as Malik said, coming in saying, I'm a leader and I've got ideas for you. So I'd say that humility is a key part.
Okay.